This is a CBS News special report. I'm Gayle King here in New York. We have just learned this morning that O.J. Simpson has died at the age of 76. His agent said he had been suffering from prostate cancer. Now, this news comes on social media from the family of the former star running back who was tried and acquitted for the murder of his ex-wife and then found liable for her death in a lawsuit. Simpson's life story is extraordinary. He grew up poor in San Francisco, became a sports legend who won the Heisman Trophy while playing for the University of Southern California back in 1968 and set records in the NFL and then moved into acting and TV work. He was one of the most desired commercial endorsers in the 1970s and 80s, but his career fell apart in 1995 when he was accused of stabbing his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and a friend of hers, Ronald Goldman, in her home in Los Angeles. He was arrested after a long, infamous police chase that lasted for hours. After one of the most controversial trials in recent memory, Simpson was found not guilty of both murders. Goldman's family then sued O.J. Simpson, and a jury ordered him to pay $33 million in a wrongful death judgment. But that was not the end of his legal troubles. In 2008, he was convicted in a kidnapping and robbery scheme involving some of his own memorabilia. He served 9 years in prison before he was paroled in 2017. Joining me now by phone is journalist Ed Gordon, who covered the O.J. Simpson trial for BET, and he was the first journalist to interview Simpson after his acquittal. Ed Gordon, good morning to you.
Good morning, Gail.
Ed, I actually remember that day. I was watching that interview. I think the country was riveted to that interview because we all wanted to hear what O.J. Simpson had to say. What was your thought when you heard that he had passed away this morning?
I literally, Gail, am at an airport. I just got off the plane and checked my phone. Needless to say, I was getting all kind of calls and texts, and it is a bit surreal. I mean, we all can go at any moment. But to think about, as you read, who O.J. Simpson was, this star running back, arguably at his time the greatest running back of all time in the NFL, then to become a pitchman and a movie star, and then, the tragedy that befell the Goldman family and what it's become. And so I think back, Gail, as you know, how divided this country was based on that trial. It's extraordinary.
Ed, I still remember when that verdict came in. He's still proved to be, I think, up until the end, a very divisive character. At the time, it seemed to be divided among racial lines. I remember there was a lot of celebration in the streets from some members of the black community, and a lot of people were just in shock when the verdict came in when he was acquitted. What do you remember about that time?
Well, I remember that specifically, and I also think it's important for us to say, Gail, that I think a lot of African Americans had their doubts as to whether he was innocent or not, and much of the cheering was not necessarily for O.J. Simpson, as much as it was for someone who, as misguided as this may sound at first glance, had beat the system. That African Americans had, for so many years, been railroaded into jail, that you finally had someone rich enough and powerful enough to maybe, and I underline that, evade the system. But it's an extraordinary time that we lived through. You think about the white Bronco and the chase and all that led up to his arrest. And I don't know that we would be able to even think about the proportion of it today, simply because social media, think about this, Gail, had he been on the freeway, even though the helicopters followed him, you would have had so many camera angles from phones and everybody trying to be, the reporter on the scene. It's just an extraordinary time.
He was acquitted in that case, but there was forever still a cloud over O.J. Simpson. And how do you think he navigated that? Because, many times he would still be walking in the streets. People were asking for his autograph, wanting to take a photo with him. And still there were others that saw him as a pariah.
That's a great question, Gail. I had been with him on a number of occasions after the fact. And what he would do is when he would see someone looking at him, he would quickly go to them and say hello to them before they could say anything. It was a disarming tactic on his part, if you will. So if he was afraid they were going to say something rude or vile, he would try to disarm them because he was a charismatic person. He was bigger than life in many instances. And so he would try to speak first, and he was, and some people will rail at this, but he was charming at times. And so he leaned on that charm to disarm people.
Yeah, charming is not what the Goldman family feels about him, or
No,
many members.
Certainly not.
No, the Goldman family or the Simpson family, and I was always thinking about them during times like this.
Yeah, and it's hard to really kind of put your arms around this. It didn't bring any of those people back. It didn't ease the pain of those families who still today grieve the loss of those two people.
And he always, Ed, even right up until the end, he always maintained that he was innocent.
He did maintain that, as you say, until the day he passed away. And he was quick to suggest that he always was, in his words, searching for the killer. There were those who will suggest he never did that. But he did maintain he had absolutely nothing to do with it. And as hard as that is to believe for many people, and you think about this, Gail, for as long as it's been since those gruesome murders, O.J. Simpson remained, up until he died, the face of a murderer for many. Even today, there will be comedians who will use him as the butt of a joke. And so it was something that stuck to him until his last days.
Ed Gordon, thank you so much. When I got the news, listen, we had heard that he was sick and that he'd been sick for a while, but it was still very jarring to get the news because it just brought back all the memories about that trial. And I still, to this day, keep thinking about the tragedy of the Simpson family and the Ron Goldman family. Thank you, Ed Gordon. Thank you for talking with us this morning. Just a reminder, we are remembering O.J. Simpson. He has died at the age of 76. His agent said that he'd been suffering from prostate cancer. O.J. Simpson's family said that he was surrounded by his children and his grandchildren when he died last night. There will be more coverage on our streaming service, CBS News 24/7, and tonight on the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell. Many of you will now return to CBS Mornings. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Gayle King, CBS News here in New York.
Carl E. Douglas joins us now. He's a civil rights attorney and was a member of what's known as the Dream Team. Those were the folks defending O.J. Simpson during the murder trial. Carl, I just want to get your reaction to this news of the death of O.J. Simpson, and perhaps you can share with us your experiences with the man.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on your show this morning. I was surprised, even shocked, when I learned about O.J.'s death this morning. He had a very complicated legacy, and I'm sure that while some will only remember him as someone who was accused of two brutal murders, as you stated, I knew him first as a football star here in Los Angeles when he starred at USC. I knew him second as a National Football League running back, setting mileage records and yardage records for all. And then I knew him third as an icon who was able to go and move from athletics to commercial exploitation, both on a corporate side and in Hollywood. Before Michael Jackson, before Tiger Woods, there was O.J. Simpson running through airports and highways, hawking cereal, cars, and rental-car agencies. I certainly send my condolences out to his 4 children, and it's impossible on this day to not remember that 2 young lives were taken far too soon, and we must always remember that as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Carl. I appreciate also that, as you point out, the different lenses from which people had that touchstone to O.J. Simpson in many ways influenced how they felt about him. I'm wondering, given that you were part of the team that saw him acquitted, that got him that acquittal, to later see him serve time in prison because he was convicted of armed robbery and kidnapping. As people are trying to process even that, I'm curious about how you processed it when that happened.
I was devastated years later when I heard about his arrest in Vegas. But at the same time, I believe the sentence that he received in that case was a payback for the acquittal that we obtained in Los Angeles. The crime that he committed in Vegas was probably a 2-year crime dripping wet. But for that judge to impose a sentence of 9 years, for that 33 years, for that judge to hold the jury so that the verdict would come on the anniversary of the verdict in our case in 1995, says to me that there was some connection, regrettably, and that justice was not served in that matter, at least.
Carl, let's just take a moment for our viewers. Let's keep in mind that while the entire country was transfixed on every moment of that trial, you had millions of viewers. There are some people watching who weren't alive then, and this was before their time. So just for our viewers, I want to reset what was the culmination of that weeks and months-long murder trial. You were part of the team defending O.J. Simpson when the judge came back and the jury returned the verdict. Let's just look back at that for a moment.
In the matter of the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, case number BA097211. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187.
Take us back to that moment. Where were you if you were in the room? And did you believe that would be the verdict?
I was sitting inside the well right by the swinging door, right in back of Lee Bailey, who was at the front desk. And let me tell you, I've only cried out of joy 2 times in my life. Once when my son was born, and second at the O.J. Simpson verdict that day, because that was, for us as trial lawyers, the culmination of 16 months of effort, day in, day out, Saturdays, Sundays, evenings, and for a trial lawyer to have success in their effort, vindicating the time and the effort that we 9 lawyers expended away from our families, away from our law practices, was in fact a great victory for trial lawyers everywhere. It's also important to remember that O.J. Simpson happened to have millions of dollars that he was willing to spend on his own defense. And it really raised the specter of how public defender agencies across this nation lacked the resources that O.J. Simpson had, so that we could combat the awesome power of the state by having investigators, expert witnesses on our own side as well. And it takes that level of resource for public defenders nationwide to be able to combat the awesome power of the state. So that case, I think, was a bellwether for that as well.
And Carl, I think that is an excellent point, because he was the most well-resourced in order to try and afford the dream team and be able to hire the best attorneys and have that time. And other defendants don't have that. But it also, I think, when you're speaking, it also goes to a point that Anne Marie and I were making about truths about the justice system that were revealed through this case, even if it's imperfect, even if you felt like the decision was not the one that you at home would have come to. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit, especially as a Black attorney, being in front of America, as were other members of the Dream Team, trying to defend this Black man who had become a celebrity that was adored by the public, regardless of race. What truths were revealed through the course of this trial that are still being struggled with today?
Your listeners don't understand that era of our country. That was before the internet. Emails were not as widely used as today. That's before Twitter, Facebook, or X, Instagram. So everyone was transfixed on this case and on this trial that was being led by an African-American attorney. What that case did for the image of Black lawyers everywhere was significant because it reflected the fact that competence comes in all colors. To this day, 30 years later, I am embraced by members of the Black and Brown community because of the work that I did on behalf of O.J. Simpson. For decades, centuries, Black and Brown people have believed that the system did not work for us, that racism was permeating our system and making it impossible for justice ever to be found by Black and Brown defendants. And whatever you think of this verdict, for Black Americans, it was not speaking about O.J. Simpson per se. He didn't speak to the Black community in the ways that other Black icons did. But for the system, for Black lawyers to be successful, for people to believe that at least once in our history, the system acknowledged the excellence of Black lawyering, that was a watershed event for all of the country to observe. And I'm proud to have been a part of that 9-member team.
And Carl, before we let you go, as we speak to you on the news of O.J. Simpson's death at 76 years old, do you feel that in the years after this trial and that controversial verdict, that he ever really repaired his reputation?
It's unfortunate because the one thing that O.J. always wanted at the conclusion of this case was that he would be able to return to the community that he loved. And regrettably, he did not have that benefit in his life. Although if you were to have asked O.J., he would always remember the fans who beloved him, even after the case. He would always speak and be mindful of those that would ask for autographs or pictures, and he would ignore the other. But it is regrettable that this great athlete, this icon, had his career and his legacy so soiled by the events of 1994 and 1995. And regrettably, it is those events and that trial, I believe, that will remain the primary aspect of his legacy moving forward in history.
Well, as we're talking about his legacy, he was not a perfect man. He was not a perfect vessel for understanding race relations in America. He wasn't a perfect vessel even for understanding the criminal justice system. As you point out, he had more resources than others. And then he was later convicted in a criminal trial for armed robbery. It's a complicated legacy. How do you think he should be remembered?
It is impossible for any fair-minded person to examine the career of O.J. Simpson, one, without acknowledging his tremendously efficient contributions to the sports world, but at the same time, understanding and acknowledging as well that his entire legacy will be soiled by the memory of that trial in 1995, even though he was found not guilty of those charges. It is regrettable, but that will, I'm sure, be the legacy that will always remain.
And Carl, what about for you? Did you face any backlash throughout your career because of the verdict?
I, fortunately, have been uplifted in my career for the last 30 years since the O.J. Simpson trial. I remember quite easily when I first would appear in court after that trial and announce my name and my having worked at the law offices of Johnny L. Cochran Jr. Everyone in the courtroom would stop and listen because that name resonated. I was able to open my own law firm successfully a couple of years after that, and I modeled my practice over the Johnny L. Cochran law firm model. And my success, I am sure, was in some small part a reflection of the successful effort that we had on behalf of O.J. Simpson in 1995. So certainly, I acknowledge and understand that my name will likely always be linked with his until my death.
Well, Carl Douglas, a member of the Dream Team that secured that not guilty verdict for O.J. Simpson. Thanks for joining us on this news of O.J. Simpson's death. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
We want to bring in now Zoe Tur. She's a news documentary filmmaker with News Media Films. She was piloting that helicopter that actually broadcasts the O.J. Simpson police chase in Los Angeles in 1994, capturing all of our attention. Zoe, discuss what it was like actually being the pilot in the air, broadcasting what the entire country tuned into, that low-speed chase.
It was surreal, to say the least. It felt like somebody had punched me, in the chest. Here was O.J. Simpson, this television star, this movie star, a man that golfed with presidents, running from the police like, the other 200-300 pursuits I've covered. It was shocking. And to be able to find him, of course, we're in the news business and we wanted to find him. I was just shocked that we did.
Zoe, how did you find him? I mean, Los Angeles is massive. The number of vehicles on the road on any given day, let alone the early 90s, is in the tens of thousands. Take us inside the helicopter. How did you capture the moment?
Well, it started outside the helicopter at Parker Center, LAPD's police headquarters in downtown Los Angeles. Lieutenant Gascon, the spokesperson for the LAPD, announced that O.J. Simpson was supposed to turn himself in, but was in the wind. And it took me a second. I had to ask him, in the wind? And he goes, O.J.'s a fugitive. He's didn't show up. We're searching for him. So every law enforcement agency in, the United States now is looking for O.J. Simpson, every reporter, the public. And so I looked at my crew. We were downtown, said, let's get to the helicopter. We walked across the street to the heliport. I got into my helicopter, and then the discussion moved to, where would a malignant narcissist go? And I thought it would be the gravesite of Nicole Simpson Brown. And I flew down to Orange County, which is drive time about an hour and a half from downtown LA at that time. The helicopter was about 20 minutes. I went to the gravesite, no OJ. There was a undercover vehicle staking it out. So they had the same suspicions that I had. And then my assignment desk manager radioed me and said that there's been a sighting at the El Toro Y. And I was listening to the FBI frequencies, and sure enough, she was right. Mary Helen Campos was her name. Anyway, I looked down, through the chin bubble right below, and there was a white Bronco, and I couldn't believe it. And then to confirm that it was OJ, the first sheriff's unit arrived, the second, the third, the fourth. Flip of the switch, we were on, the air live with close to 100 million viewers around the world watching this spectacle start, and it gave birth to reality television because the audience was huge, and it was just crazy.
You spoke about Los Angeles at the time, how much you loved and sort of fed off of the city. And as we're trying to understand this particular moment in time, and you brought us some of the most iconic images, I'm wondering if you can share some of your reflections.
Reflecting about this, first of all, I want to say that you cannot forget the victims. Ron Goldman didn't deserve this. Nicole Simpson Brown didn't deserve this. OJ got to live to 76 years old, and he got to die surrounded by family members and grandchildren. The reality is they didn't get that. They didn't get that. They never got to live out their lives and die in their own beds. So my heart's out, for the surviving members of the family. And good riddance to O.J. Simpson. It couldn't have come sooner. He was not a nice person. And true to form, it appears as though, at least now, that he died without sending a message, at least giving some closure to the family members. acknowledging his role in the killing. I mean, this man wrote a book, How I Did It, or If I Did It. It was If I Did It, and I mean, what kind of person does something like that, And so,
well, Zoe, we really appreciate you taking us inside the helicopter, giving that first-person account of how you tried to figure out where O.J. Simpson was at the time, and we appreciate you joining our coverage, Zoe Tur.
Of course, thank you.
We now want to bring in Jim Newton. He's a former editor-at-large for the Los Angeles Times and was the lead reporter on O.J.'s trial in the early 90s. He interviewed O.J. in February of 96 and nearly came to blows with him, we understand, according to a follow-up article written years later. Jim, what's your reaction to this news and the legacy O.J. Simpson leaves behind?
Well, I was startled to hear the news. I didn't realize he was sick, much less approaching death. So, of course, surprised. Legacy, boy, that's a hard question. I mean, he obviously has a legacy as an athlete, but his memory in Los Angeles, of course, is his life as an athlete was vastly overshadowed by the circumstances of this case. So I don't know what a legacy of what kind of legacy a murder defendant leaves, but whatever it is, that's what he left.
Jim, it's interesting because we've heard from different people who have very different feelings about justice being served or not being served in this case. Errol mentioned your interview in 1996 and that it was contentious, to say the least. I'm wondering if you could share the insights that you had coming out of that.
Yeah, it was a strange episode. My colleague Henry Weinstein and I were sitting in the newsroom, and Simpson actually called into CNN to say something, and he said something about coverage and was complaining about coverage. And our lawyer, Carlin Galler, suggested that we should just drive over to his house and talk to him about it. So we did, and he let us in. And we talked for quite a while there in his breakfast nook. It was contentious. He had complaints about coverage. At one point, he tried to take my tape recorder because he was worried that we would sell the tape. That's when we sort of got into it because I reached up to get it back. And I must say, I thought for a moment that we might come to blows. And my first thought, I guess because I'm a newsman, was that Henry would have a great story about it. But it's actually the only time I ever sat down with him one-on-one, despite the fact that I was in the courtroom for many months, just a few feet away from him.
And Jim, what I think is interesting is in coverage of O.J. and even in discussing now his death, you kind of have two topics. There's the man himself, who he was, the imperfection, the criticism, but also the fascination over that trial and what it says about the United States and the rest of us. As a reporter who covered that trial at the LA Times, what did the trial of O.J. tell the rest of Los Angeles and the country about itself?
Well, those are the big questions. I would say it's important to remember that the Simpson case unfolded here in the media just less than 2 years after the beating of Rodney King, I guess 3 years after the beating of Rodney King by LAPD officers in Los Angeles. So issues of policing and race and racial justice and excessive force, all were they were certainly at the center of my coverage and very much at the center of civic life in Los Angeles. And so I think it's important to realize that because this case unfolded with that still very much in the air, we'd had a riot over those issues. When there were allegations by the Simpson defense team that the LAPD could have framed Simpson or focused exclusively on him, a prominent black man, those were not to be taken lightly at the time. And so I think as the trial played out, we saw stark racial differences in the way people received and heard the evidence in that case. And so it was certainly a reminder of the deep divisions along race and class in Los Angeles, and I think in the country at large.
Jim, as you're going back in time and thinking about how you covered this, is there anything in particular that jumps out to you about, wow, if I knew then what I know now, I would have done something differently, or even that becomes so much more important now as I think back on things?
Yeah, I don't have, maybe I should have something that I feel like I should have done differently. I'll tell you what really sits with me all these years later. I was in the courtroom the day the verdicts were read. And I remember Simpson and the defense team's kind of sense of triumph and victory. But what really lodges in my memory is the sound of Kim Goldman bursting into tears. And, for all of the trappings of sort of a circus, or there was kind of festivity around this trial almost. There were people selling T-shirts and things outside. That moment always brings me back to the real story here, which is this was a brutal double murder with real victims
who never ultimately got the closure they were seeking. Jim Newton, we so appreciate you giving us some insight from your point of view. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Simpson made the NFL Hall of Fame after an 11-year career with San Francisco and Buffalo. He was also infamously at the forefront of a major criminal trial in the 1990s after he was accused of murdering his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ron Goldman. Perhaps that trial has overshadowed any of his accomplishments on the field or during his broadcasting career as well. He was acquitted of all those charges, though. But in a separate case, Simpson served 9 years in prison after being found guilty for a 2007 armed robbery in Las Vegas. He was released on parole in 2000. He was released on parole, I believe, in 2017. And so now there will be a lot of discussion about his life and legacy, a powerhouse on the field, an incredibly impactful spokesperson and broadcaster. But the trial for the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman is what looms large. The entire country was transfixed, not only when there was news of the murder, but on the day that he was supposed to turn himself into police, he slipped away and embarked on this hours-long slow-speed chase in the back of that white Bronco. The nation was riveted. The chase was covered on cable news, followed by helicopters and news cameras, and really, the entire nation stopped to watch this unfold. Eventually, he returned back to his home, and the reports are that he was given a chance to go inside his Brentwood home, drink some orange juice, and then turn himself in. The trial itself was a moment in American history. It was one of the first times that cable news was able to air a trial from beginning to end. And he had with him what was called a dream team of attorneys. Johnny Cochran, Robert Kardashian. Now, his own children are almost more famous than Robert Kardashian. Robert Shapiro and F. Lee Bailey. And they embarked on a defense that was riveting. Anyone who watched this trial remembers sort of the key words. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Something close to that. And it all had to do with whether or not a glove fit on O.J. Simpson's hands. That was sort of a key pivotal moment in the trial. So you heard Ed Gordon talking with Gayle King just a short time ago, and he's joining us now. He was the first journalist to speak with Simpson after that infamous acquittal. Thank you so much for pivoting over to us, Ed. This is that trial, and the conclusion of that trial, it's one of those moments where if you were alive, you remember where you were at the time. And
that's right.
As the viewers know, Ed, I was not in this country at the time. I was in Canada. I was still in school, and no one was in class. Everyone was watching the verdict, and there were cheers and there were groans. It was a moment of sort of great division.
It was all of that. And if you think about the trial, and as you noted, it was broadcast daily. It became a true reality show. You know, we call reality shows that, but they are not. And this had people transfixed. People were skipping not only class, some people would skip work at times, and certainly work had stopped altogether the day the verdict was announced. And if ever we wanted to see an indication, we talk so much about the division in this nation between the races today, but if ever we wanted to see an illustration of that, that certainly the day that verdict came down, was it when you looked at the personification of division.
Yeah, I think that's so clear. And I think, excuse me, Ed, as I clear my throat a little, I think that over time, people's opinions about that verdict evolved and changed. But at that moment, and you sort of really articulated it really well with Gail, there was this idea that the justice system is rigged against African Americans. And for once, here is a Black man who is able to beat the system. It seems sort of ludicrous at the time, but that was sort of part of the logic for many people when they saw him being acquitted.
Yeah, that was certainly part of the ethos. And I think the other divisions that you saw is people wanted to know where you lined up before the verdict came down. I can recall many white colleagues asking me, well, what do you think? What do you feel about O.J.? It was a real sense of, quite frankly, the idea of, are you for us or are you against us? And it was that simple for them. And so, again, we don't want to lose sight that two people lost their lives in all of this in a gruesome way. And it's very sad, and we still all grieve and pray for those family members. You never get over something like that, even after all of these years. But we also have to remember that the Simpson family, certainly had a rough go of it. His children had a rough go of it after the fact. And so there were no winners. There was no way to, button this up neatly. This was just a sad day across the board.
Yeah, I know certainly it was a frustration for the Goldman family and for the Simpson family, for Nicole's sister, who became a very sort of outspoken advocate for those who were victims of domestic violence. It was very frustrating for them to watch O.J. Simpson not only walk free, but also kind of become a kind of like a cult personality almost. It was something that they tried to remind the public that these two people had been murdered. But as time went on, there was increased distance between the horror of the crime and this sort of character that O.J. Simpson became. Ed, I want you to just sort of hang on a little bit because I want to bring in CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman. Ricky, were you, I think Court TV, this kind of put Court TV on the map. Were you working for Court TV at the time?
Not only was I working for Court TV, Anne-Marie, but I was specifically hired in order to anchor the O.J. Simpson case. So that was the beginning of my television career. And the first appearance that I had on Court TV was at the preliminary hearing. And then during the course of 1995, was in Los Angeles with the late, great Fred Graham to anchor the case for Court TV. Then I also followed on television for Court TV the robbery trial that later happened in Las Vegas. And then finally for CBS did the parole hearing. So he has really been part of the arc of this second career for me after practicing law. I think that there can be no doubt, as the previous commentators have noted, that the day of the verdict was a day of reckoning in this country. And we really saw the difficulty of the race divide on that day. When you were present for those many months in Los Angeles, watching the trial all day long, commenting, analyzing the trial, you had a different feeling when you were watching it on camera than when you had a moment where you were allowed to go into the courtroom and realize the charisma of this man. He would be brought in from his holding cell. And there are those people, and they're very few indeed, who have something about them that the room vibrates from them. And of course, the infamous moment at the trial that I think none of us could ever forget, every viewer in the country who saw it, was the day he tried on the glove and that the glove did not fit. And of course, it created Johnny Cochran's brilliant closing argument, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. We knew, Anne-Marie, that I would say Fred Graham and I knew that there could be no doubt that after the jury had deliberated for 4 hours on the first day, and then said that they had a verdict and that the verdict would be announced the following day. It had to have been an acquittal because they could not have possibly sifted through all those months worth of evidence to come up with a guilty verdict. So we were up on the scaffold, and when you looked down, there were demonstrators all over the streets. It was a bit of a circus, a carnival, people wearing O.J. Simpson masks, having T-shirts already with a, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And what got lost in that, which goes back to your previous guest, what got lost in that was the horror of the crime. What got lost in that was the anguish of the victims' families and the people who were so invested in having O.J. Simpson convicted. Keep in mind one other fact in my soliloquy here, if you will, that this was one of the first cases that was televised nationally where the defense, in great part, was that O.J. Simpson was framed, that the glove had been dropped by a police officer named Mark Furman to frame O.J. Simpson, that the blood had been carried by a Detective Van Ader and brought back to the crime scene because he didn't log it into the property office. There were all kinds of factors that could have led to the not guilty verdict, including the prosecutor's decision to try the case in downtown Los Angeles instead of in court in Santa Monica, where they would have had a very different jury.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Ed, that you brought that up, Ricky. And I want to pivot over to Ed to add like a little more kind of historical context, because, you know, Ricky brought up Mark Furman, and that became kind of a whole other conversation about the LAPD, about the relationship that the LAPD had with the African-American community. And I think that also added to the feeling that many people, many Black people felt about O.J. Simpson's acquittal.
I think it's important that we note that both can be true. As we look back historically on the way that the crime scene was handled, Van Ader and the others, and certainly the baggage that Mark Furman brought to the table, you know, all became part of the mix. You know, if it were a Hollywood movie, people would say, well, that's just way too much.
Yeah.
And so certainly the dubious relationship that the LAPD had with African Americans over the years had to factor in people's thoughts of, you know, it being believable that some of the things that were whispered about that possibly could have happened, a frame up and the like, could not be dismissed easily. And so all of these things, you know, the confluence of everything that happened really made this what it was. It was a phenomenon. It was an extraordinary time for this nation, and quite frankly, much bigger than simply the trial.
It really was. And Ricky, I want you to talk a little bit about, you know, O.J. Simpson was the central figure, but it was like everyone else involved became these larger-than-life characters as well. Mark Furman, certainly one of them. Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden. You know, I remember kind of people watching what Marcia Clark wore and how she wore her hair, and of course the dream team of attorneys. It was like we were watching a movie unfold and not a criminal trial.
It was the sublime and the ridiculous all at the same time. I had gotten to know Johnny Cochran prior to this, was actually in his office when he received the call to be a part of the team. And so I was on the phone with Carl Douglas, as Ricky suggested, when the idea or the word came down that the verdict was back. And Carl said, I got to go. We got a verdict. And I said, you can't. Like Ricky, I thought, how could they have a verdict this quickly? And he said, I'll call you back. And he hung up because they had to get back. He had left thinking, okay, they're not going to come back this quickly. So many people had to rush back to the courthouse. And so, you know, I don't think anyone who wasn't born or wasn't old enough to recall what this was, I don't think we can fully articulate and explain the chokehold that this trial and this murder and these incidents had on this nation and on the world, quite frankly.
Yeah, Ed, I think you're spot on with that. And as both of you are talking, there are these images that are kind of coming back to me, right? Of course, the image of O.J. Simpson trying to fit this glove on his hand. When the announcement of the acquittal happens and O.J. Simpson's face and Johnny Cochran's hand on his shoulder and Robert Kardashian's face at the time, because I remember the conversation was that Robert Kardashian almost looked stunned, like he himself did not expect that verdict. Ricky, I'm wondering if you got a chance to talk to any sort of, in your career, any of the members of the Dream Team about what it was like to participate in this trial.
I was friends before the trial, during and after the trial with both Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, who were the science guys. And this was a trial in great part based on DNA, having to do with that blood sample and where blood should have been and where blood wasn't and where blood was. They were friends, as I say, for many, many years and still are. Johnny Cochran and I became friends during the trial. We had an extraordinary friendship and then later did a TV show together called Cochran and Company. I was company. And Johnny Cochran came to my surprise 50th birthday. And then my husband and I think we would say we were quite honored to be on the guest list for Johnny Cochran's funeral, which was one of the most amazing things I have ever witnessed. And of course, Johnny Cochran was a civil rights lawyer. He was a women's rights lawyer. He was a champion for people who did not have money and fame. And when he was at this funeral, of which there were literally thousands of people, both outside and inside, and you had people outside Johnny Cochran's funeral with one of many of Johnny Cochran's books who were weeping. It was an extraordinary display, particularly of the African-American community, of what he meant to them. Mm-hmm. And the answer to your question is yes, I have spoken with those people about how they reacted at the time of the verdict. But what happens in a private conversation of recollection is that I think, as Ed says, people were stunned on the defense team, and yet they knew because of the length of the deliberation and because of the power of Johnny Cochran's closing argument. And as I mentioned, the charisma of Simpson trying on that glove as close to the jury pool as about a foot away. And he went from juror to juror, that all of those things were going to bring back an acquittal.
Yeah. Ed, over the years after the acquittal, yes, he had a huge judgment against him for wrongful death, millions of dollars that he owed. He had to start selling a lot of his property to try and raise some of this money to go to the Goldman and so I believe Simpson family, but certainly the Goldman family. And then there was this kind of odd spiral. He wrote a book, If I Did It. He, at one point, sort of dabbled in kind of like a prank show. And it felt like when it came to the general public, there was a reaction to the verdict, and then slowly people were like, can you just go away? Can you stop talking? You knew O.J. Simpson. I'm wondering, did he ever kind of speak about kind of his evolving, the way the public sort of approached him and felt about him, the way it has changed over the decades?
Well, I think that people have to realize he knew he was a pariah. And when we think about the idea of some of the things that he did after the fact, there was a need for him to also make money, quite frankly. And so some of the things that many people saw as in poor taste or dubious, some of that was simply that he felt like it's not like I'm going to get a corporate job. It's not like people are going to look at me. And he told me this. We were looking at doing another interview with him, and I sat down at dinner with him to try to convince him And he said to me, it's not like people are forgiving me for this. It's not like the justice system in this country says if you go through trial and you are presumed innocent at that point, at least the verdict came down that way, that you should be allowed to live your life. And he understood that did not apply to him.
Why do you suppose, though, and for many people, he would have been treated as a pariah, but for many people, he was still somewhat of a celebrity. How was he able to hang on to that?
Well, I don't think it's him hanging on to it. I think it's America's obsession with celebrity. And as I said to him at dinner, because people were coming over asking for his autograph, and this was, years after the trial, and he talked about still being famous. And I said to him that night, you realize that it's more infamy than fame now. But either way, you still get the adulation or at least the attention from people. And I think that was less on O.J. He treasured being a celebrity before this. He certainly did not mind it. But I would say that I think speaks more to people than it does O.J.
Ricky, I want to talk about another personality that was kind of forced into the spotlight, the judge in that case, Lance Ito. And I'm trying to recall sort of how I felt about him at the time, but I think he received some criticism, which is inevitable when you're dealing with such a high-profile case.
Lance Ito is really the primary reason why many states and perhaps the federal system as well has tried to keep cameras out of the courtroom. If anyone was enamored with celebrity at the time, it was Judge Lance Ito. And one of the clocks that we would keep track of at Court TV was the clock of how many minutes per day that court was actually in session with the jury, and how many minutes per day Judge Ito was in his chambers having conferences, that's a kind way of putting it, with celebrities. I remember the day, for example, that Barbara Walters came to court, and so he invited her back, and they had conversations, and everyone is waiting for the trial to continue on. He was really fascinated with his own.
3 or 4 more minutes.
So interesting. You're bringing it all back to me now. I want to bring in one more voice for us. Bring in Entertainment Tonight co-host Nichelle Turner. She's joining us now on the phone. Nichelle, we have been talking about O.J. Simpson's life, but inevitably we're talking an awful lot about the trial, not just the crime, but also the cultural moment that occurred during this trial and the evolving cultural character, I guess, of O.J. Simpson. It's sort of hard to sum up, and it's really hard to explain if you weren't kind of really paying attention back then, because the way people have felt about O.J. Simpson has changed radically since, his time on the football field to now his death.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you think about that trial, I think it was watched by about 150 million people on Court TV. And that was, in the inception and really cemented Court TV and what courtroom, playing out on television, what that looked like for us. It was the public's fascination with it. I'm actually watching, video of this trial on television right now. And it was so fascinating at the time because, yes, we had this figure who was beloved on the football field and then also had made his mark in Hollywood. I mean, he, was in several Naked Gun movies, and he was in the Towering Inferno, and he had all the Hertz rental car ads of O.J. running through and jumping over, things in the airport. All of those things is how we saw him, and we saw him as a beloved figure. And then here you had this just incredible shift, and we're all seeing this play out in front of us on television, and it became also a bit of why we are such a voyeuristic society, and in Hollywood as well, because we were consuming all of this on a daily basis, and no one could get enough. No one could get enough of seeing this.
It's so true. And, we talked a little bit earlier with Ed about how divisive this trial was. How it was a moment in time when, you know, it was a moment in time when the LAPD was under a lot of criticism for the relationship that it had with African Americans. It just seems stunning when I think about how there were cheers when he was acquitted and how that changed over time. But can you kind of bring us back to, you know, how you were feeling or how people felt when that acquittal came down?
I remember where I was. So I was a college student, and I was working in a retail store when it was handed down, when the verdict was handed down, and I remember just silence because I was also working in a place where there weren't a lot of minorities, and it was just silence. But what I remember distinctly was that split screen of people watching. And there were people, I think it was like in Inglewood, and then there were a video of people somewhere else, and it was like black people and white people, and just the dichotomy of the two reactions. I still remember that's burned into my head of how when you saw the community of mostly minority people, there were cheers, and then the community of white people, they were sitting stunned. And you're right, that sentiment has changed over time, but it was all part of what the division was in the country at the time, because we had seen, the Watts riots, we had seen the 92 riots in L.A. from Rodney King, and we had seen like these images of police brutality and what people felt like how black men had been treated. So then here you have this black man who may not have been connected to the black community and of his own doing and of his own, saying, may not have really been connected to the black community at that time, but the black community still felt like he's one of our own, and they connected to the police brutality part of it and what they saw as an injustice in a lot of ways with the system, and they connected to OJ in that way. And so we saw all of that playing out. And I remember even conversations within my own family, how people were split. And how, some people would say, oh, he didn't do it, he was set up, because we also saw Mark Furman, who, a lot of people in a lot of ways feel like won that case for the defense in his actions and his words and what he was doing. And people really did feel like the police had planted evidence. But then on the other side, you saw people saying, guys, let's be logical here. Look at all of this evidence, and why is he on this, why are they chasing him? And also remember that day of the low-speed chase with the Bronco. The NBA Finals were on the air at that time, and it really, there was a split screen on television of the NBA Finals in a picture-in-picture and the OJ chase, and they didn't really know what to do. Do they air the NBA Finals or do they air the OJ chase? I mean, it was such huge news at that time.
Man, Nichelle, you hit on so many layers, just sort of taking me back in time. And, you sort of said this very quickly, but you talked about O.J. Simpson's connection to the African-American community at the time. And that's another layer, right? He's married to this beautiful white woman. He's living in a very wealthy section of L.A., and many of the people that he's associating with are white. And there was a conversation about, geez, when the chips are down, when your back is against the wall, now you're remembering.
You come back to the black community.
Exactly. Which also led to kind of a division within the community about how they felt about this case. So we're going to bring in CBS News radio journalist Allison Keyes. She's joining us now on the phone. She covered the Simpson trial with ABC News back in the 1990s. And I think, we'll just start with kind of like your most vivid memories, because I feel like, Lana, as we talk about O.J. Simpson and his life, there are iconic images like that, him holding up what we're showing, just so you know, him holding up his hands and the glove not fitting, the moment he was acquitted, the image of Nicole Brown Simpson with bruises on her face when they was talk about, the domestic violence that she endured. So I want to ask you, Allison, kind of what are the images that come flooding back when we talk about this?
Well, obviously, the day of his acquittal and the glove. I must say, I was a writer-producer at ABC News in Chicago, so it was my task to watch that trial all day, every day, and it was really hard, especially because O.J. Simpson meant so much to the Black community. He was a Black man made good. He was a celebrity. He played mentor to LeVar Burton's Kunta Kinte and Roots. You could see him running through the airport in the Hertz commercials. He was on Naked Gun. He was a football star. So this is a man the Black community was like, aha, see, we can do this despite the racism in Hollywood, despite the racism in the nation. So this whole thing just blew people's minds. And it was really difficult to be Black journalists watching this and then having those discussions with white journalists. We're like, how can you not think he's guilty? And I'm like, okay, I'm a journalist. I'm not the one that chooses that, but there are a lot of questions here. Black America thought he was framed in a lot of ways. They thought that evidence was planted. They didn't believe this man could do such a thing. At the beginning of his case, he was like, I am absolutely 100% not guilty. And then when Johnny Cochran, who became famous in his own right, had Simpson try to put on those gloves and said, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit, people were like, yeah, he's not guilty. So when he was found not guilty, it was a huge wedge between Blacks and whites, not only in the newsroom, but on the street. You couldn't walk into a restaurant or a bar without people talking about this and yelling at each other. And I think it really exposed, the ongoing racial divide in the nation.
About that, Allison, because I also was thinking about O.J. and Nicole Brown Simpson's children, who straddle that line between Black America and white America. And then we're also straddling this line of, is dad a killer? Mom is dead. All of that. I wonder if you know anything about how they're doing, the relationship that they have with their father. Obviously, the relationship with Nicole Brown Simpson's family was fractured and never came back from that. But as a kid, seeing these other kids and thinking about them going through that, I think it was also part of us trying to navigate and understand this conflicted history.
Because these are kids that should have had everything in life, right? Yeah. Their father is a wealthy football hero. Their mother is a beautiful woman who adores them. And really, they should have been able to sort of skyrocket. They should have been able to do anything they wanted.
And on the stand, both of their parents were dragged. Nicole
I can't even imagine what that was like for them.
Her reputation was trashed in the course of this. His reputation was trashed, and you have these innocent children who are already suffering this tremendous loss.
I can't even imagine how they are dealing with this now, with his death. And to see the images of them on television just broke your heart. And then there was the whole Black community thinking, well, part of the reason that he's in trouble in the first place is that he's with this beautiful white woman. Remember, they were showing those gorgeous images of her on the sidelines of the football fields and her hair blowing in the wind and everything. And they were just like, this is retaliation for a Black man who got too far. And I think that his family must have never been able to get over this. And certainly the Brown and Goldman families still don't feel that they've gotten any justice here because he did not go to jail for that murder. And there are a lot of people that still think that he's guilty.
Yeah, I talked about questions of justice, right? Yeah. Because yes, there was the justice for the victims, which is the point of a criminal trial. But then there was this overarching theme, I guess, of justice for the African American community within the justice system that seemed to kind of overshadow the fact that these two people were brutally murdered, and to this day, there has not been a conviction. No one has been held accountable for their deaths. And that kind of got pushed by the wayside. And part of it, part of it is because this was one of the first trials, if not the first one, where the public was able to watch almost every second of the testimony.
Yeah. And we watched it even before that. From the moment that white Bronco was traveling down the road in that low-speed chase, we were all invested in it, and we were all captivated and watching every single second of it.
What would that be like on social media these days? There would be cameras following him all up and down the expressway. AC getting on the phone. This is AC. I've got OJ in the car. You know who I am. And everybody went, wow, you know, and the car is moving at like 5 miles an hour. But one other thing I want to say that in 2008, when Simpson was convicted on charges including kidnapping and armed robbery over the sports memorabilia, a lot of black people thought that that was payback all those years in prison for not having been sent to prison for the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman.
Yeah, and part of what OJ had said at certain points was that he was trying to make a life for himself after being convicted in the public's eye in many ways. And it also goes to Anne Marie's point about justice and how he could be acquitted of the crime, but still then have a scarlet letter.
Yeah. I mean, for so many people involved in this case, at least for us, and I don't know what I couldn't imagine what it's like for them, but this case was where everything sort of stops and starts. You know, it's a pivot point. And so as we were talking, I started to think about other, for lack of a better word, characters. Do you remember Kato Caitlin?
Yeah.
And like he became like a whole other character, right? This house guest.
And what a character.
Let's not forget the dog.
Sorry, Allison, what did you say?
I said, let's not forget the dog, who was almost a celebrity as well,
honest
right?
to goodness.
I mean, all those elements and what imperfect proxies they were for bigger problems in society.
Spot on, spot on. So, of course, we are going to continue to cover the breaking news, which is that O.J. Simpson has died, 76 years old. We learned in February that he had been diagnosed with prostate cancer and was undergoing chemotherapy treatment. But his family said on X that he has passed away. He was surrounded by family, and they're asking for some privacy at this moment as they deal with this transition. But of course, the whole country will be talking about him, his life, his legacy, the trial, and what
it also revealed about all of us.
There you go.
I knew OJ for a while. I remember the low-speed chase up and down the freeway and things like that. And I also remember everyone's opinion of that low-speed chase and of OJ. And what had happened. It's a sad period of time that was and still is because of the loss of lives. And people are, their opinions are very, very strong one way or another.
Still to this day.
Oh yeah, and forever will be because of what happened and because of who it happened to. I remember being called by the station that morning to tell me what happened. And I know that there were different industries around town that were very, very upset, like where he played golf. The golfers did not want to have anything else to do with him after that. So I will say this, there's not a lot of sympathy from a lot of people in the general public because of what happened. The feelings are very strong, the feelings are very negative, and the feelings are very lasting.
Can I just ask what it was like for you? I mean, you've seen a lot of things in Los Angeles. This really did change race relations in America, or maybe brought them to the fore. Maybe I shouldn't say it changed them. It brought them to the fore, race relations, views on the criminal justice system, on the civil justice system, and how we make TV with watching chases, how America was just glued to these characters, this story, this plot line that was unfolding.
Controversy always creates curiosity. And that's what that was, and that's what this is, and it will always be. And those kinds of things attract, get your attention and make you wonder. Some people watch for different reasons. Some people watch because it is a story. Some people watch because they know the people that are involved. Some people watch because of the quote unquote, the visibility of what's going to happen. It's a shame that it's like that. But there's this saying, it is what it is, and that's what happened here.
Well, you know, it's so interesting. Being a sports fan myself and having so many different sports figures that we talk about, we lift these people up in such a huge way. And OJ was one of these people that America celebrated. He was, you know, as a football player, right, before any of this happened. You hadn't really seen someone like him where he went from the football field. Now you look at the Travis Kelce's of the world who cross over and now he's hosting a game show. But OJ went from being a Hall of Fame football player
player, up for the Heisman Trophy, all these awards in different areas of football. But then he goes on to make 20 movies. He, he's part of pop culture. He's part of, being a pitch man. And we bought things or wanted to align with companies because of him. Can you just talk about that period of time and then what it was like for you to see just such a shift in people's minds of who he was?
Sports is something that we all can relate to. Mm-hmm. It's so exciting. Just look at, we get the Super Bowl coming, and we got the Masters coming, and those kinds of things. And when you think about those events, you think about the individuals who are participating in those events. And those individuals who participate and they have an outstanding performance, they're put up on a pedestal. And they get commercial endorsements and things and they should. Mm-hmm. Some people take advantage of those situations. Others just kind of accept it as a part of life. This is a very sad story because of the lives that were lost here. Many people have many different things to say about it. It's just, I remember it, and I remember it with great sadness because of the lives, as I mentioned, that were lost. But when you attract a lot of attention and a lot of publicity, there's a lot of curiosity, and then along with that comes a lot of commercial endorsements. And when you have that, sometimes that makes people feel that they are better than maybe somebody else. And we're just talking pure facts right here. We're all the same. And when you look back on this tragedy, it is sad. It is really sad, and it should make us all think about how we conduct our lives every day with our fellow mankind.
All right. Well, Jim, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate your perspective.
Where were you the day that the verdict was read? Do you remember?
I think I was in school, and I think everyone turned off stopped class and turned on the TV and just watched.
It was such a cultural moment, and we have veteran journalist David Goldstein, who actually covered the infamous double murder trial of O.J. Simpson. Thank you so much for being with us.
Sure.
Can you take us back, having covered this, as to the 1990s here in Los Angeles? This ended up being a moment where I think it revealed there are two Americans when that verdict was read. One cried, one cheered. Take us through.
Yeah, it really was a slice of life for what was going on in Los Angeles at that time. Big distrust between blacks and whites in the city, and this trial sort of brought it all to a head. People were, your friends would, you would lose friends, win friends over this, what people thought about his guilt or innocence. And it was an amazing time in the city, because while it was this one trial, it really showed the problems not only in Los Angeles, but in cities all across the country, the distrust of people in the criminal justice system. So people were just riveted, and obviously because O.J. Simpson was, prior to that, famous for being an athlete, a spokesperson, an actor, and just somebody who a lot of people admired.
Yeah, it was about race, justice. It was also about wealth, right? Mm-hmm. About whether if he had all this money and the stature and power and celebrity, would he have been found, been exonerated. It was also a time that really created this huge media circus. I think 95 million people watched the infamous slow-speed Bronco chase.
Yeah, no, everybody was watching that. Everyone was watching the trial. At KCAL, we covered it live, gavel to gavel, and I was down there at the courthouse every morning at 8:30. I was sort of moderating that whole trial, and people were watching. I would leave and go home or go to a store. Everybody was asking, what's going on? What did you see in the courtroom? What didn't we see in the courtroom? So many people were watching this. And you just showed Ron and Nicole, and the tragedy here is that two families lost loved ones here. They had to live through this whole circus of a trial, and obviously to this day they're still living with it, and that's the tragedy that sometimes people gloss over in this case.
Well, and that's, if people are just joining us, we should go over a little bit of the timeline. You think about O.J. Simpson, 1985, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. He was this famous football player, charismatic, good-looking, acted in about 20 different movies and films. He was a pitchman. You remember the Hertz car commercial? I don't think people ever forget of him racing racing through. And then in 1994, tried for the murder of his ex-wife and her friend, Ronald Goldstein. And what's interesting here, 1995, he's acquitted. And then you flash forward to 2007, where he then is arrested and goes on trial for attempted kidnapping, robbery, this plot, because he's fallen from such grace, trying to still lead the lifestyle he once had, trying to get money pumped into his life. He ends up then going to prison for 9 years. It's remarkable culturally. Can you just talk about the impacts you've seen in Los Angeles as someone who, not only covered the trial, but then through all of the developments later on in his life?
Well, I think it had a profound effect on the criminal justice system in Los Angeles. The trial, a media trial, cameras in the courtroom. There's no cameras in the courtroom today. There were back then, and the reason the cameras aren't there today is mainly because of what happened during the Simpson trial, and judges and attorneys didn't like the fact that every little thing they said was pieced apart on the news that night over and over and over again. So that changed in the criminal justice system. I think the whole issue of money and somebody who had so much money could, if you want to say this, walk away and win a case that perhaps people thought he was guilty, and it brought home the fact that money could do this. They called it the dream team at that time. He had the biggest attorneys in town, and over and over and over, and he kept bringing another one and another one and another expert, going up against an underfunded DA's office. Nobody could go up against that kind of money and those kind of experts, and you basically had 2 deputy DAs going up against the dream team, and that certainly had a lot to do, I think, with what the final verdict was. It just changed Los Angeles. It brought to forefront the issue of blacks and whites in Los Angeles, and how, as you mentioned, how people viewed this trial differently. Some people cheered when the verdict came down, others cursed it. So it brought home the differences in this town at the time.
And it was just almost made for TV. Some people say it was kind of the beginning of reality television, because people were hanging on every word that happened in the courtroom, and this tapestry of characters involved. Like you said, the dream team, you had OJ, you had these deputy DAs, one of whom's now running to be a judge. I mean, you had such characters involved, and it kept going. There were always these new developments and new evolutions, these stories.
There was always something that left on a cliffhanger on a Friday afternoon. There would be some issue that they bring up in court, and we'll settle that on Monday, and that would be the big issue that people were talking about all weekend. It really, people were really watching every move in this trial. It was the first time that DNA was really used openly in a trial, and I remember the DA's office, and they were criticized for it. They spent about a week explaining the minutia of DNA and how scientists can figure out whose DNA is what, which I don't think they would do today, because it's more or less understood today. The DNA matches you as the suspect, and pretty much people accept it. But back then, it was something brand new. And so there were so many riveting parts to this case. I'll tell you on a personal note, I mean, you guys have seen me, and the viewers have seen me over the last 20 years, and how I, question people and go after the people that we exposed in our investigations. But I look back on the time that I was outside Parker Center, the old police headquarters, when O.J. Simpson came back from Chicago. He was being questioned by police. He was still, the man who everybody admired. And he comes out of the police station, and my question to him was, "OJ, are you a suspect?" And his attorney says, "David, we're not going to answer those questions." And I pretty much didn't answer and didn't ask another question. I would have looked at it and done that differently today, but that's just who O.J. Simpson was. And you looked at it, and he was this idol to millions of people.
You've spoken on it a little bit, but I want to go back. The racial tensions that this trial did end up bringing up in this country, I would argue, are still prominent today. You look at what happened in 2020 with the death of George Floyd and the mistrust of police and a white officer and a black man who's killed. And, you know, I think it still permeates to this day. I mean, we've never really gotten over some of these issues that stem directly from this trial.
No, I don't think we have. And I think it's still when an African American is on trial, there's still questions that are being brought up in parts of the community on whether he or she could get a fair trial, and looking at the composition of the jury and things like that were certainly at the forefront back in the early 90s in this case. So I don't think much of that has changed. I'm not sure it ever will change. A lot of people question on whether the O.J. Simpson case was really the case you were going to dissect as far as Black America and white America. So I think that question's always going to be there.
And there was, of course, the question, you know, the reason he was found not guilty, that the jurors said, was because they thought that the white police officer planted evidence. And then, of course, the famous line. I mean, what was your reaction actually being there when you heard the line about the glove?
You know, that was a Friday afternoon, because they always came through with these little cliffhangers on Friday afternoon, and I was watching it, and they put the glove on, and the glove apparently, by looks at it, didn't fit. And I remember repeating those words from Johnny Cochran when we went to the break after that. And I think one of the producers in my ear reminded me that, hey, you know, we don't know if it didn't fit. It appeared it didn't. That's up to the jury to decide. But you just get so involved with it as a reporter, and this moment of putting the glove on and the camera right above it, looking down at it, and there's the picture there. It was an amazing time. And again, if I'm correct, it was a Friday afternoon, right at about 2:55. They quit at 3 o'clock, and that was the moment that everybody thought of all weekend long, until wondering what they were going to do Monday morning.
Wow. And the only time we heard O.J. speak throughout that entire trial, right?
Yes, he didn't. He didn't testify in that trial. So yeah, that was about the only time.
Wow, we could dive into so much, the connections to the Kardashians, just what this has done to pop culture, the chases we now cover, and how we do that. There's so much. But David, we're going to let you go. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great having you reminisce, you know, even remembering
dates. Coming out of retirement for us, David. Thank you.
For you guys, anytime.
Appreciate it.